Good afternoon, good morning, depending upon where you're at. I'd like to thank you for joining us on the webinar today, How to Avoid a Failed SSO Project. My name is Greg Wendt. I'm the Executive Director of the Security Solutions here at Appsian. And what I wanted to talk about today was obviously I'll introduce Appsian, who we are, talk a little bit about why single sign-on, and then two, kind of go into the pitfalls of some of the things that we have seen with different projects that are out there. Also, the technical details of how we work inside of the PeopleSoft system, and also how the single sign-on obviously connects and works. So then a quick demo on the back end so you guys can actually see everything. Once again, this is a webinar, so everybody will be muted. So if you do have any questions, please use the GoToWebinar control panel, which is normally on the right-hand side of your screen, to submit any questions. I'll try to make sure that those questions get answered during the session today. The session is also being recorded, and we will have a follow-up link and update afterwards as well. So if there are any additional questions that aren't answered on the session, I'll have an email address at the end where you can reach out to get those questions answered as well. So with that, why don't we go ahead and get started? As I said, we are Appsian, and we have two different main product areas. We have a UX product area and a security platform that sits inside different ERP spaces. Currently, we're inside of PeopleSoft and SAP, and we'll be launching some more here shortly. One of the things that I wanted to do was talk a little bit about some of our customers. We've got over about 250 customers, almost 300 customers. Here's some of the different customer verticals. When we talk specifically about single sign-on, I have not found a vertical that's not interested in it. So across the board there, I could pick and choose numerous different customers that are actually running specifically single sign-on. So you can see that we're very diverse in the customers that we work with. We're from very, very large to, some of them that are obviously much smaller, but the pains and agonies of single sign-on are definitely consistent across those different verticals. So when we talk about why, the business and how it's being accessed is different. If you think about the security challenges with traditional ERP, it used to be very, well, I'm not going to say simple, but it was simpler. It used to be that everything was behind the corporate firewall. You didn't have to worry about anything, and that only the 500 people or 200 people, whatever users access the system, could access the ERP, and that's about how it was utilized. But now what's happening is, one, the cost of these systems, and two, the integration points, because a lot of times they really are the source of truth, especially when you're talking about maybe a HCM or campus. And by source of truth, I mean that from a integration with the employee or your customers, because this is where you have the most information about your individual employees. So it can drive integration to other applications, if that makes sense. So as we talk about the changes to that, think about your business model and how different it is now compared to where it was 5 years ago, 10 years ago. Even think about it from 15, and you'll probably drastically freak out. It's now very dynamic and mobile. A lot of the transactions have changed how people are accessing the system. And then on top of that, we also have compliance issues. Think about the different privacy laws that have come into effect in the last several years. Obviously, GDPR is kind of the big iceberg there. But we've also got the California Consumer Privacy Act. There's about 5 or 6 different states now that are in process of implementing different privacy laws. So those aren't anything that are going to go away. So it's definitely something that you're going to have to continue to work with. And really the user-centric threats are changing. And by that, it really is because as these large applications are moving and shifting how people are accessing them, it's becoming difficult to really delineate where your network may end and where it stops when you're talking about having VPN, mobile workforce, all of those other type of things. It really changes how your network security might be viewed from that perspective. It really is about managing the identity of this particular user, and that's one of the reasons why single sign-on is so important with the growing adoption of all of these different scenarios. If we think about it, we go back to our customer base, for example. looking at the higher ed, which is where we really got our start on the security side and the UX side specifically. And I think the reason why is because that particular vertical has always been publicly accessible. They've always been outside their firewall. The students have always been able to add, enroll, drop classes, pay bills, all of those type of business functions to do and work within what they need to get done. Well, a lot of those students are now employees and they want the same type of functionality out of the same systems when they're working for these companies now. So now you see the shift to mobile applications, remote work, self-service. A lot of times before you could only do self-service inside of the organization, not outside, and how all of these different adoptions are changing how these applications have been used. Changes the security of them, changes the footprint and how many people are touching them. Before you may only have had a couple hundred users that accessed your ERP. Now you may have tens to hundreds of thousands of users that are accessing it, not necessarily on a daily basis, but if you're thinking about how many times they may touch it in a month, you could have 100 to 200,000 unique users go through your ERP in a month, where probably 10 years ago, that would almost be unheard of. From that particular idea of having that many people access the system. When we look at the adoption of those different policies, the BYOD policies, that's bring your own device. One of the things that you have to be concerned about with that, as well as with bringing your own device, what type of data are you going to have access to? What are you going to allow those devices to do on your network? What types of transactions, data access, all of those other type of things. So it is definitely the change of how businesses are looking to get the ROI back out of these applications and really deploy them and utilize them the way they were designed initially to be done as well. So that's one of the main reasons as to why we see a lot of adoption of single sign-on, or a push towards that. Managing the single point of user ID and password helps as well when you're dealing with the identity provider of adopting all of these different points. So when we transition over to how to avoid a failed SSO project, there's a lot of different moving pieces here. It's difficult, especially when you're dealing with PeopleSoft. It doesn't natively support SAML, for example. So when you talk about trying to integrate it with SAML, it becomes very challenging. And by that, there's a lot of different pieces that have to come into play. You can end up with proxy servers. You can end up with customizations to your PeopleSoft system. You have to be able to upkeep the tools releases. Is it going to cause any changes from the application releases? So all of those different things increase your carrying cost. Just adding additional servers into the mix. Are they load balanced? Are they single point of failure? How are you going to deal with that? So there's a cost increase, and often not. The project gets delayed because you're having to interface and integrate many pieces of technology, and it becomes very challenging. And just trying to figure out how all of those pieces go together can really be a really big burden, especially when there's a problem in any of those particular stacks. The PeopleSoft stack is large enough to begin with, if you think about it, with an app server, a web server, a process scheduler, and all those different touch points. So, by adding in additional proxy servers, connections into customizations, modifying PeopleCode or sign on PeopleCode events, all of those things to implement that, plus another hardware and maybe even virtual stack inside of the procurement side, really does make it challenging and add a lot of complexity into the environment. And that's one of the things that we really want to stay away from. So that customized single sign, how many organizations, and this is kind of a question that I know you guys can't answer, but one of the things that I have found is working with many different customers that have implemented single sign-on is the fact of dealing with the identity provider. How often do you stay on one identity provider? What I see is a lot of organizations are switching between them. They may have multiples. I know one organization that at least one, I can name probably a handful of them that I know that are using as many as 3 to 4 to 5 different identity providers inside of their enterprise architecture. And why that happens from numerous different reasons. It could be as simple as acquiring other organizations and trying to integrate them in when they've already got something else running. So the environment becomes very challenging with all of the different touch points. So when you're thinking about how you're going to integrate that into a PeopleSoft system, a customized SSO really has a lot of additional challenges. You are going to have to customize the application. You're going to have to do something with proxy servers. There's a lot of touch points that you're going to have to bring in. And one of the other things is PeopleSoft continues to make changes through their people tools architecture. And as they do that, some of those changes that they make are going to cause challenges inside of the single sign-on environment. So you're going to have to be able to work with those to move forward. Also, if you've done any sort of customization inside of the application specific code, you're going to have to carry those forward as well inside of that lifecycle management. And when we think about how many times PeopleSoft or Oracle delivers a new update a year, depending upon the stack that you're working with, that can be as many as 4 to 5 different people tools releases. You've got 4 critical patch updates. You could have as many as 5 to 6 application updates, depending upon which ones you're running, especially within HCM or campus solutions, for example. You're easily going to get into that 4, 5, 6 number of updates a year that you're going to have to work with. So you're talking about having to uptake and configure and test a lot because of the changes that are going to be happening to that environment. So another challenge that we see frequently comes up is deep link navigation. And that's one of those things that some organizations find a need for, some don't. What I find is everybody wants it for the most part, and the reason why is because it goes back to those reasons as to why people are adopting or leveraging these applications in a broader sense now anyway. That they want to be able to deploy these solutions and gain as much of an ROI as possible. So what an advantage of single sign-on is that users can move in and out of the applications. They can work with other users inside of the organization without having to sign in and out of applications. So deep linking navigation is really important, especially if you think about it from approvals perspective. So maybe on a financial side, that could be expenses, could be any sort of purchasing type thing. It's required that you want to be able to update and approve and keep those purchases moving or the expenses paid. And a lot of that happens via workflows. So those workflows that are coming in, if you have and want to support Deep Link to truly give you a single sign-on solution, that's something that becomes very important because that's where a lot of the efficiencies and the transitions are. And ironically, most of the people approving a lot of those are higher up in the organization anyway. So it's kind of a black eye when they're the ones that might have to be dealing with signing in and out of an application or not being able to support that Deep Link navigation. Another thing that I wanted to touch on is really identity provider flexibility. And I kind of touched on this a little bit earlier, but it can't really be understated because this is something that a lot of organizations are dealing with. Keep in mind, let's go back to a higher ed, and I'm just going to use this as an example because I've seen it a couple of different times. They may start in the world of Shibboleth because it's open source. You don't often see that from the corporate side because they don't necessarily go with a lot of open source code unless there's somebody to support it. But when we talk about Shibboleth, for example, from an identity provider, a lot of organizations in higher ed have adopted that type of model. Well, now if you think about the business, maybe there's a shift to, let's say, the Google Docs or even Microsoft Office 365 to where you're going to provide email and Word and PowerPoint and all of these different solutions to that end student, for example. So now all of a sudden I'm almost having to support both an O365 and I have to support Shibboleth. Sure, I can connect these two and make them talk to each other. A lot of things going on behind the scenes, so you got a lot of different touch points, all of those other type of things. Well, it may reach the point where I can shift off of my Shibboleth provider and I can move all the way to Office 365 because I don't need that anymore because it's O365 is providing so much via ADFS or Azure, for example, that I can use that. The same type of example could go on with Okta or Ping or any of the big identity providers. As you're moving through, you'll often have or find that you're using multiples of each one, and you may find that you want to expire or get rid of one out of the organization. And from a technology perspective, all of those different touch points or customizations that you have built in to integrate the single sign-on with that particular provider often doesn't work with another provider. So you might have to do a lot of custom coding again to rebuild that integration to another identity provider. So this is something to definitely keep in mind, because I have a feeling as an organization, you'll probably come across reasons to look at or change. It might just even be cost alone that you want to switch identity providers with. So why is a configurable solution ideal? We've kind of been talking about it for the last couple of slides, but a configurable solution really allows much faster implementation, less resources, and allows a seamless switch. It can actually, live in an environment to where you can support both. It allows you to transition. Your end users really have an ideal situation to where they're not necessarily forced overnight to do something. You can blend and transition groups of users over as you want, whereas custom solutions are often fragile. They might lack the flexibility or functionality for some transactions, like the workflows and deep embedded links. And it becomes challenging to move from one to the other. The infrastructure can't really be understated enough when you're talking about integrating proxy servers or reverse proxy servers. Just even alone from the logging perspectives as to what's happening inside of your environment and being able to track back maybe who did what. A lot of times when you're looking at detailed logs inside of an organization, sometimes when you're dealing with proxy servers, behind the scenes, it becomes very difficult to tell maybe a source IP address. So it may end up as your reverse proxy or your proxy or your load balancer, rather than actually carrying that source IP address. So even figuring out who's connected from where and being able to troubleshoot all of that, maybe from a performance or, God forbid, incident response, that can become even more challenging by the additional hardware that's actually in place. And then also just the time consuming part and expensive. The expensive and time consuming often not is because you may only have one person that understands how the entire custom solution works. I've heard and talked to numerous organizations that are like that. I mean, it's, for lack of any other name, it's Jimmy or Sally or Susie, whoever it is inside of that group owns this. And if it weren't for this one particular person, it becomes very challenging to integrate, or to make changes, because they own everything and they're the only one that understands from top to bottom what actually has to get done to make these two systems talk. And that becomes very challenging, and also becomes a kind of a single point of failure. You are tied to this person from an organizational perspective. And that's something to really think about when you're talking about a configurable solution. One of the other problems or challenges that I see with the custom solutions versus configurable is how your users are going to interact with the system. Configurable can allow you to change. You can treat people differently. You have better choices, where from a custom solution or a point solution, you may only have one and only one way that you're going to interact with those users and that application set, which can get you into additional challenges as to how you want to roll out. Maybe you're going outside the firewall for the first time, and how are you going to do that when everybody is doing, custom SSO or scenario like that? So that custom solution often limits the ability to really adopt and roll out single sign-on the way you want to. So those are some of the challenges and things that I have seen. So when we talk a little bit more in detail about how we work and solve this problem. So I'm going to give you a little bit more detail than just what's on the slides here. So we are a security platform that plugs into the PeopleSoft web server. By plugging into the web server, we have additional context. There's not additional hops. There's no proxy server. We are in line with the PeopleSoft transactions themselves. So we understand when the user is authenticated think a PeopleSoft token, that PS token. So as the user makes a request to the PeopleSoft system, what we're going to do is we're going to look for that to see if they're already authenticated. If they're not authenticated, what we're going to do is we're going to challenge them with the configured identity provider. So let's say ADFS. I'll actually demo a couple of different identity providers today for you, just so you can see it. But let's talk ADFS in this example. So we're going to go off to Microsoft Office 365 ADFS, and we're going to authenticate. So I'm going to put in my user ID and password, and what's going to happen. At that point, I'm going to pass the authentication request at the identity provider. So what is the identity provider going to do at that point? It's going to come back to our security platform, and it's going to let us know, one, that you have passed authentication, and two, it's going to give us a piece of information. Once again, that piece of information is configurable. So that's going to be an attribute value. That attribute value is going to say, this particular PeopleSoft integrates, this PeopleSoft system integrates on user ID. So I'm going to give you the name ID coming from the attribute value. It could be email address. It could be any other piece of information that the identity provider has that can pass back to us through that attribute value. So we are then going to map the user with that attribute value. And they're going to end up with a PeopleSoft session, just as if they had signed into PeopleSoft directly. It's just they use the identity provider for authentication. So sounds pretty streamlined, sounds pretty efficient. So why don't we actually look at this working a couple of different ways? So I'm going to flip over to a web browser, and what I want to do is I'm going to sign into our Office 365 environment. So I'm just going to bring up an Office login. I'm going to sign in as Vicky's in, and I'm going to go ahead and put her password in. So I'm going to go ahead and sign in. What's going to happen at this point is it's just going to drop me into a SharePoint site. That SharePoint site just has deep embedded links into the PeopleSoft system. So talking about deep workflows or deep links. So this is actually going into the personal details page inside of PeopleSoft. So if I click into that, you're going to see that I'm opening up the page of the additional info. What's happening behind the scenes right now is the communication is going back and forth between the two of the identity provider and the PeopleSoft system. Since I hadn't authenticated into PeopleSoft yet, it noticed that we had not had a PeopleSoft token established. So I'm going to go ahead, check the identity provider. The identity provider mapped me as Vicky Zinn. So I'm now in as Vicky Zinn. You can see I have my deep embedded link of the personal details. If I look at the menu structure, for example, she's got all of her menus. So all of her roles and permissions that she can normally access on a daily basis, she can go ahead and access any of them. It just so happens that that deep embedded link brought me all the way to the additional information tab. You can see our page. You can see I've got some data masking involved here as well. So I masked out the social security number and also did a click to view around the date of birth. Not going to go into a lot of information on that today because we're specifically talking about the single sign-on process and how we can do this. So I'm going to go ahead and close out of that. One of the other scenarios is email. So what if I email out some information to my users and I want them to click a link and access PeopleSoft? Very quickly, they can do the same thing. I can come in, I can look at my banking page. I've got this embedded and protected with multi-factor authentication, so nobody can update their account number without having to go through MFA. But they're moving in and out of the application just as they normally would without having to deal with authentication. So they can drive in off of the Office 365 environment, do whatever they need to do in those target PeopleSoft applications without having to authenticate. Improves productivity and also the security because you're able to authenticate with that identity provider. So I'm going to go ahead and sign out as Vicky. Let's talk about why you might want to do a couple of things differently. So I'm going to come back into that PeopleSoft system. But instead of going to ADFS first, one of the question is, well, what happens if they try to go into PeopleSoft without authenticating to the identity provider? How are we going to control that? So I'm going to go ahead and just start typing. a deep embedded link into PeopleSoft. So this is the fluid landing page. So I'm just going to go ahead and hit enter. What you're going to see is it's going to redirect me immediately over to the identity provider. So here I am back at ADFS, and this is any SAML based identity provider. So it doesn't have to be Office 365, just happens to be what I'm demoing with. So I'm going to sign in as a different user. You can see that I've got a different email address there. So I'm going to sign in. This one happens to be more of a power user, so I could gain access to some back office information, scenarios like that. But the nice part is, once again, now I'm in. From an authentication perspective, I have a consistent authentication to maneuver my users in and out of the application. So they don't have to be coming in with PeopleSoft user IDs and passwords. One of the things that we can see, once again, user has all of their access. I'm going to quickly sign out. And what I want to do is I'm going to come in from the login page. This is the same PeopleSoft system. So one of the things that we can support is the ability to still utilize a PeopleSoft user ID and password if need be. So I'm going to sign in as PS1, that same user that I was just signing in as. Let me do Vicky's in. So as I sign in as Vicky, you can see that I can use that two-tier user ID and password. The nice part is maybe it's a high privileged PeopleSoft admin, DBA, batch user, those type things that aren't configured inside of your identity provider. So it's one of the scenarios that you can still support those users and allow them to connect. So it's nice because you can utilize multiple different ways to allow them into the system. And that kind of goes back to the flexibility of a configurable solution, because it doesn't have to be applied to 100% of your users all the time. What we have found is maybe on-prem users. So when you're dealing, inside of your system, let's use single sign-on. When you're talking about self-service users, maybe at that particular point, or retirees, a different group that's not necessarily within your identity provider, you can utilize PeopleSoft user IDs and passwords at that point if you would like. So those are some of the different integration points. The nice part is it's all configurable inside of the same system. You don't have to come up with different customizations or touch points or all of those other type of things. Very configurable and streamlined. Hitting on that note, it does bring up a reason or a point of that two-tier user ID and sign in. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sign out here real quick, and what I want to do is come back in as a different user and a different login. So I'm going to come back to that deep embedded link. So I'm going to sign in with the ADFS user ID and password, and I'm going to come in as Vicky's in via single sign-on. The reason I wanted to do that is I just wanted to show you something from a support perspective that we have the ability to do. So one of the things that we have is switching over to a privileged account. So when you talk about that scenario of having that two-tier user ID and password that maybe doesn't exist inside of your identity provider, one of the things that we often find is being able to allow users to sign in a low privileged, maybe just self-service style access. Maybe I'm a PeopleSoft admin, and in production, I only have self-service. I only need to act as that high privileged role when I'm doing certain things, so I can then transition to a role or to a user that has the ability to do that. So if I go ahead and sign in as PS, for example, I'm going to go ahead and switch account to PS. I've got this system configured where if anybody signs in as PS, they have to pass multi-factor. So I'm going to pass that real quick, and I'll approve that. Well, now I'm in and acting as PeopleSoft. So what we're going to do is we're going to log everything that this user does as this stepped up account. So we're going to create logs that says Vicky's in is acting as PS, and this is what she is doing. So that way, in case you do have shared accounts for either batch or testing or PeopleSoft admins, DBAs, those type things, when they're interacting with the online application, you can help control that to where they don't necessarily have to have those user IDs and passwords to maneuver in and out of the application, if that makes sense.
Hey, Greg, do you mind if I pause you real fast and
Sure.
ask a question?
Definitely.
A couple things have come in. So first and foremost, how does Appsian handle if a IDP user ID is different from the PeopleSoft user ID?
Oh, great question. So if the PeopleSoft user ID is different, often not, what we'll do is we can use any of that attribute or that piece of information that we get from the identity provider. We can go look it up as well. So let me give you an example. We had an implementation where we did single sign-on, and this was probably about 18 months ago. And they had two disparate PeopleSoft systems. And by that, I mean they had an HCM and a financials that didn't talk to each other. They didn't do PeopleSoft single sign-on between them. They were physically two different systems. And in the PeopleSoft HCM system, what happened was they would use their user IDs. So that system used user IDs, where inside of the expenses or the financial systems, it actually mapped with email addresses. So even though we did a single sign-on configuration and implementation for them, those user IDs were different in both of those target locations, and we were able to set that up through the integration with the identity provider, taking an attribute and then being able to map that user inside of the system. So we can definitely look that up. It doesn't have to be a one-to-one relationship between, here's what I signed on to my identity provider with, and that has to be the exact same in PeopleSoft. Often not, it's not. And through our configurations, that's all set up. And I'll show you how that gets set up in just a minute as well.
Okay, excellent. And there was a follow-up question, actually. You had mentioned a switch user, and was that a part of Appsian or PeopleSoft?
This is part of our security platform and something we've done.
Thank you.
Perfect. So as that user, going back to the kind of that switch user, is now I would be acting and doing anything inside of the application as this stepped up user. So if I wanted to complete the process and go back, I can finish and say I go back to my original user, or if I log out at that particular time, the session's invalidated on both of them as well, but I can switch back to the original account, and now I'm acting as my lower self-service style account as well. So that would stop the logging. We would move back to that lower level account. So just an example of how we can work from that particular idea and perspective. I'm going to go sign out here, and I'm going to go back to the login page, and I want to come back in as PS1 because it's a higher privileged account. And what I wanted to do is talk a little bit about the configuration and how this setup is done, because that's where the real power of the solution comes in. We do install a project into PeopleSoft. So that project includes our menu structure, which is everything under Appsian. I'm going to open up the application security platform, and then I can open up the rules that are defined and running against this system. The project that we deliver doesn't have any PeopleSoft objects, so it's a very black box bolt-on that goes into the database, very easy to work with. So it isn't something that you have to worry about from that perspective. So when I look at the configuration of the definitions of single sign-on, for example, what we have is inside of our rules engine, the conditions have to be true for the security action down below to fire. Now that security action, you'll see in a second, can be multiple different things. This one happens to be the integration with SAML ADFS. So when we're talking specifically about the conditions, some of the things that we might be looking for is the user not logged in. What that is a condition that's telling us that the user doesn't have a PS token. So that's internal to our system. So we know that they haven't authenticated to PeopleSoft before. The other thing that we're looking for is that the user is not at the login request page. So once again, I said this is all configurable. So you can pick and choose the conditions that you want to put in here. These are just some of the examples that I went through with working with the system. So when the user doesn't have a PeopleSoft token and they're not coming from the login request screen, what's going to happen is they're going to get challenged with the identity provider. Well, how do I know which identity provider they're going to be challenged with? This is where the configuration comes in. So the security action, I'll select the SAML ADFS, and then I have a provider or a profile that is defined for this system. So this is the active profile that I am working with. What I just did, just so you know, behind the scenes, is I opened up Cloud Identity, and the SAML ADFS identity providers. So that's what opened up behind the scenes. This is all just the configuration of the identity provider. How do I communicate with it? What do I do? How do I speak IDP, if that makes sense? So I have a name of what I'm going to call this provider. I can pick which protocol I'm going to communicate on. Maybe, a lot of times SAML 2.0, for example. So what am I going to call this PeopleSoft system inside the identity provider? And then where do I go from an authentication or logout? Those are the things that I need to know to be able to communicate with the identity provider. All of this will get loaded into your identity provider. So when you talk about streamlined teams and implementation, there's about 5 to 7 lines. Don't hold me to the exact number, but about 5 to 7 lines of XML that get loaded into the IDP. What that XML does and tells the IDP is it registers this PeopleSoft system basically to say, yes, it can communicate with me. And what am I going to send back to them? What is that attribute? So that goes back to the question that was just asked about the different user IDs or attributes. You can pass back whatever the PeopleSoft system needs. That all occurs under the user mapping. In this situation, I have a username that's going to come back. That's the name ID. Doesn't have to be. I'll show you one of the other configurations that I have set up as well that is something else. So if I go back to the first tab, you can see that we have additional parameters that you can pick and choose as well. The auth-in request, for example, would force the user to put in their user and password credentials again. Maybe that your organization wants to do that, doesn't have to. It's all choice. The expiration, check signatures, those type things, I would definitely do in a production environment. This is a demo environment, so I don't necessarily have each and every one of those configured, if that makes sense. But the nice part is a lot of these options are all configurable as to how you want to interact with that IDP. So you just come in, work with the settings. Once you save those, then it's invoking that single sign-on when and where you want to do it based upon those conditions. And that's really how quick and why these implementations can go so fast is because of how it's integrated and all configured from that particular perspective. I'm going to go back, return to search here real quick, and I want to remove this one because I want to show you something else as well. I'm going to open up the OKTA auth. This happens to be an integration with OKTA. So wondering, well, why do I want to show the integration with OKTA? It has some different information. It communicates on SAML, the user mapping. It's using OKTA email rather than coming in on the name ID to kind of show the differences between the two. But let's actually see that at work here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to authenticate. I'm going to use a different browser session. So I've just opened up a Safari window real quick. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to log in to a deep embedded link into that same PeopleSoft system. And immediately, just as what you saw earlier, how I redirected the user over to the identity provider, here I get authenticated or pushed over to OKTA. I'm going to put in my OKTA credentials, and you're going to see that up at the top, I've still got that same HRM URL, and it's pulling me into a deep embedded link for my team. So I just signed in as Betty Lockerty. I'm now into the system. I've got access. I can maneuver through, look at all of my different, menus, components, everything that I have access to. But one of the things that you'll notice if I, look at the URLs, I'm in hrm.appsian.co. Same over here, hrm.appsian.co. Just different parts of the application, leveraging 2 different identity providers. How cool is that? Can your system do that? Can it be that flexible when you're talking about building in structured components and, integration points? We have customers that have as many as 5 different identity providers configured all into the same PeopleSoft system, all through the rules and the configuration. That's one of the reasons why you want it configurable, because if you decide at a later point in time that you want to change identity providers, all it is a configuration. You don't have a massive shift in technology. This is why a configurable solution is so favorable compared to a brittle, customized point solution, basically. So just wanted to show you guys that from an integration perspective, 2 different identity providers into the exact same PeopleSoft system. Configuration, all identical between the 2, basically. So obviously they have different information that they need, but that's dependent upon the different identity providers. So that's one of the things that I wanted to wrap up and show you from a configuration perspective, how you can easily transition between all of those different pieces. So one of the things that I'm going to do is I'm going to pop back to the PowerPoint, and I want to go ahead and go through, some of the high points there. When you talk about our configurable solution, we can go live in as quick as 7 days. You'll be working inside of your environment very, very quickly. We don't have an additional hardware that you need to put into play. We are in line with the PeopleSoft system, which makes it very streamlined and efficient. When you talk about the maintenance, we've got hundreds of customers that are working with this that are live in production today. So you're talking about stable, tested environments that you can talk to existing customers. Support's available 24/7, and the updates are synchronized with the PeopleSoft updates as well. So if there are changes that are required for tools, then you'll get those in your updates coming from us. So you don't have to go in and customize. When you talk about a customizable solution, you've got a lot of additional hardware that's going to end up, custom code that you're bringing in, a lot of custom management that you have to work with. It could be going down to the maintenance. You have that one and only one person that understands it, versus here you can easily have a team of people that understand how the SSO works. That wasn't difficult. It's very streamlined, very efficient. So the maintenance of this is very, very different between those two touch points. The support, when you're talking about the standardized support, when you try to go to these different identity providers and find out how hard it is or how difficult it is to work within a system that doesn't natively support PeopleSoft, there's high technical skills that are involved with this. A lot of custom consulting work that may have to all be done, versus just going to a turnkey solution that allows the configuration of the product to work specifically with the PeopleSoft system. So obviously, we're very favorable of our PeopleSoft SSO. As I said, we've got hundreds of customers working and running with this on a daily basis. And it's really exciting to see the adoption of it, and really the success and what happens inside of the organizations when they get this up and running. So very happy with all of that. So that's a lot of what I wanted to talk about today. I know we had time scheduled for about an hour. As I said earlier in the presentation, if you do have additional questions, here's the email address that I promised earlier. So you can email info@appsian.com at any time, and we will have our team will get in touch with either myself or one of our implementation specialists to get you an answer to any question that you may have out of the session today. Additionally, if you would like to follow up and have a personalized demo or conversation, definitely let us know. We can follow up and hop on a call just like this. It would probably be a meeting, obviously, where we can have a very detailed discussion and figure out exactly what your requirements are and how we can help you guys succeed in your single sign-on project moving forward. So with that, I'd like to just check with Scott and see if there was any more additional questions before we sign off and let you guys go for today.
I think you got it covered, Greg. Thank you.
All right, perfect. So with that, I'd like to thank you for attending the webinar today. Hope to see you on one in the near future or at one of the conferences that we're attending soon. So appreciate it. Thank you very much and have a great rest of your day.